Howdy, this is Lemmy with RevZilla, here to talk to you today about how to buy a bulb for your motorcycle. Now I know at first blush this might sound unbelievably boring, but I promise we're going to try and make this video both informational as well as interesting. And my guess is if you're watching this, you probably have a dim bulb on your bike. Now that might mean you have an OEM bulb that has actually gone out and you simply need an OEM replacement, or you may have found yourself just wanting a little better conspicuity and instead you're looking to upgrade your bulbs, but you're not exactly sure what to buy. Either way, you're in the right spot. We're going to get you the information you need to hopefully buy the correct bulbs. Now, one of the things that's interesting about bulbs, because they're electrical items, we don't have a way to readily test these, that our return policy is a little different on these than it is on other items on the site. As soon as a package is opened, we're unable to take a return on it. So in helping you get the right bulbs, we're also helping us make sure that we don't have to reship you stuff and you don't have a long wait time getting a replacement bulb. So we're going to talk a little bit about how some of these things are constructed in order to give you a good idea of what products might be just perfect for your motorcycle. Now at this stage of the game, this is usually when I would talk about how to find a bulb for your bike. And usually that path sort of has two tines on the fork, so to speak. Sometimes we tell you guys go right to our bike finder, put your bike information in, and we'll tell you exactly what'll fit. And then other times we talk about universal parts that will all need a little bit of massaging. Well, bulbs kind of split the difference. And I'm going to actually kind of recommend both techniques. So first, put your bike into our bike finder, see what's out there. But then I'd also say, because of the installation on a bulb, it's very easy on most bikes to simply pop a bulb out and compare it to what we're showing you in the catalog. You should take a peek at both. So I would say take the bulb out and then also compare it to what it is that we're talking about. It'll help you get the right thing, and it'll also help verify that you're getting a product that's going to work best with your motorcycle. And part of the reason I'm recommending that is that this is a one bearder on our beard scale of difficulty. It's not very difficult to either order the correct stuff for your bike if you know what to look for, and it's also not very difficult to remove and reinstall a bunch of bulbs. That's why I'm recommending you do the removal before you wind up sitting down at the computer. It's easy enough to pop a bulb back in once you're done. So let's talk a little bit about bulb history. Once you get an idea of how some bulbs are built and why things sort of exist the way they do, it should make a little bit more sense as to what bulb products might be appropriate for you and for your machine. So I'm going to start off with one of the questions you might see on a couple of our product pages. We ask it fairly frequently, and it's typically something like, do you have a single filament bulb or do you have a dual filament bulb? And we ask that question in different ways. You may also see us ask if you have an 1156 or an 1157. 1156s are single filament bulbs and 1157s are dual filament. Similarly, we may ask if you have a single intensity bulb or a dual intensity bulb, meaning do you have two separate brightnesses within the same bulb? So let's drag a couple of single and dual filament bulbs over here, and we'll talk about some of the construction things and some of the things you can do to identify exactly what it is that you have in your bike. Now the first and most basic is simply look at the bulb when you're using it. You may notice that your tail light is obviously not as bright as your brake light, and if there's one bulb serving both those functions, odds are excellent, you probably have a dual function bulb. But there's things you can look at on the bulb itself that will also help you to identify with certainty what it is that's in your motorcycle. So let's kick things off with probably the easiest thing is the filament itself. We talked about a single and a dual filament, and you can actually see those right there. This 1156 does indeed have a single filament in it, and this 1157, if I turn that, you can see there are two filaments in there. The names are very self-explanatory. But there's some other stuff too. So if we take this single filament bulb and we look on the bottom, you'll notice there's a single point of electrical contact right there. That's a good indicator this is a single filament bulb. Also, check out the lugs on the side of the base here. Those are what actually lock this thing into the socket. You'll notice they're directly across from each other here. They're parallel. Let's compare this with a dual function bulb. Now, as soon as we flip this over, it becomes immediately apparent that there are two different contacts on here. Now, in order to get those things into the right spots inside of the socket, the lugs are a little bit different on these. You'll notice they're offset from one another. One is a little bit higher up on the bulb base than the other one. Great indicator that you have a dual function bulb. Now keep in mind too, the single versus dual filament talk isn't just having to do with the actual rear end of the bike, but it may actually have something to do with the front end of the bike as well. So let's go back in history a little bit here and we'll pick up a sealed beam style headlight. So if you've ever seen an old Harley running around or maybe an old metric motorcycle, these things were pretty common on the front. This sealed beam headlight actually contains the low beam and the high beam filament in a single housing. When either one of the filaments goes bad, this whole unit gets replaced. Now this is in contrast to modern headlights. So most modern headlights are halogen in design, and you'll notice stuff like this puppy over here, an H4, also known as a 9003 bulb. This will contain both functions in the same housing, much like the seal beam does here. However, we'll also see things here like separate low and high beams. Let's head down to our BMW over here. You can see this offers the exact same setup. We've got a low beam and a high beam in separate housings. And there's some good reason why things evolved that way. The first is style and design. If you look at sealed beam headlights, they're typically made only in a few different styles. You got big circle, you got little circle, big rectangle, and little rectangle, and that's really about it. So having a separate housing with a capsule that slid into the back allowed the designers to make things that looked a little bit different and allowed a different sort of feel at the front end of the motorcycle. The other thing separate housings allow the engineers to do is to design the reflectors in the housings best for each particular job, because if you think about it, the low beam and the high beam of a motorcycle really have two different tasks to do. So we've talked a whole bunch about how it is that these guys are making bulbs and why bulbs are constructed the way they are. So let's put this into practice a little bit. Let's check out the rear end of a motorcycle. Now we're looking here at the rear fender setup on a Triumph. This is a fairly standard setup. So one of the things I want to draw your attention to is the fact that even though we see a red lens here and some yellow lenses out here, there's actually 3 different color lights that need to be emitted from this particular setup here. Yes, you've got your taillight and your brake light. That's a dual function bulb in there. You've got your turn signals out to the back there. Those need to be displaying amber light. However, there's also white light that needs to be displayed, and that's for the license plate here. I think it's something that a lot of people fail to remember, but we need to direct white light onto the license plate in most jurisdictions to be legal. So you may be wondering exactly how we do that, because there's no white light on here. Instead, what we've got here is a red lens that actually has a window in it to display white light facing downward. It's very difficult to see here, so check out over here, we've got a couple of Harley square back taillights. Now this is the exact same taillight here, and you can obviously see here the license plate window intended to direct white light up onto the plate. Now keep in mind, you're going to typically see this sort of a setup somewhere where the taillight and the license plate are adjacent, much like you can see here. If, however, you have, say, an axle mount license plate and a taillight that sits up on the fender, it's fairly obvious that the license plate is going to need its own light. This is just one of those things that you should keep in mind when you're considering the purchase of either a light or a bulb. Make sure you're directing the right color light onto the right things. It's one of those little things I think people often forget about, and unfortunately, it's a good way to get yourself an easy ticket. So let's consider something else, and it has to do again with that color of light we're displaying here. As we've seen in recent years, one of the things the manufacturers have done to make bikes look fresh and kind of nifty is they've integrated both smoked and clear lenses onto bikes. Now we're seeing these OEM as well as aftermarket. However, a clear lens or a smoked lens won't tint the light the correct color. Obviously, a clear lens is not going to display red light. So what the manufacturers do is they actually rely on the bulbs themselves to display the correct color light. You'll notice this amber coating on this incandescent bulb. That is going to help that light, despite the fact that it has a clear cover, display the correct color light. Now keep in mind, this is something you want to think about too if you're upgrading or changing over to an LED setup. LEDs can be made to emit a number of different color lights, so before you wind up ordering a bulb, just be cognizant of the fact that your bulb itself may emit a different color light than the light exiting the lens. Let's set that down, and we'll move on to another question we ask fairly frequently here at RevZilla if you're looking for lights for your Harley Davidson. A lot of times you'll see the question posed as to whether you have bullet lights or you've got instead a set of flat turn signals. And I think folks have trouble understanding the difference simply because they own one or the other and don't necessarily have another frame of reference. So we've got 2 of them set up here so you can see very clearly which it is that you might have on your bike. You'll notice obviously over here we have a bullet style light, so named because this thing looks exactly like the projectile that loads in at the front of a shell. I think it's fairly self-explanatory. And obviously these things are referred to as flat simply because they are much less deep than the bullet style signals. So if you have a Harley and you see that question asked anywhere, you know exactly why at this point. So let's talk about some of the actual bulbs that you may find yourself using in order to upgrade or replace your existing bulbs. Now what we have here is a tray of bulbs. Now these look wildly different, but these are all 1157 equivalents. You'll notice right here, this is an actual 1157 bulb. This is the size they're made to. These have certain specifications in terms of wattage as well as lumens. Every one of the other bulbs you see here deviates from that recipe in some form or fashion. Now you'll notice, obviously these are multiple different diameters. diameters here. This one, for instance, has a smaller diameter than the actual 1157 bulb itself. This one is obviously much larger. One of the other things to notice too is that we've got different heights here. So this is the actual height that this thing is supposed to be, but you'll see we have some that are actually taller. We have one that's a flush mount right here. There's all sorts of different design changes here. So one of the things to remember is just because the base style of the bulb is the same as what you have, doesn't mean it will necessarily work with your application. The first thing you need to consider is whether or not this is actually going to fit inside of your housing. Now, once we move on from there, one of the other things to consider as well is where the light is being thrown. So far, let's move back to our Triumph for just a moment here. So far, we've been talking about light sort of in that straight back plane head on. That's not the only way, however, that you're going to necessarily distribute your light. So if we were a car behind this Triumph, it would be pretty easy to see this stuff. However, sometimes you travel on multi-lane roads. There may be drivers at different angles who still need to see what it is that you're doing. Now, something like this, you'll notice there's this pattern on the inside of the lenses all over here. And that pattern on the lenses helps to disperse the light. It diffuses it, it scatters it. So if you look at something like this flat turn signal we had earlier here, that bullseye pattern does the exact same thing. It scatters the light about. However, there's some lenses that aren't quite as good at that. Check out our bullet over here. Look how smooth that is. That thing's not nearly as good at dispersing the light. So if we move to a bulb that doesn't have that same multi-directional capacity that a standard incandescent bulb does, we may find that we make our conspicuity worse. It may improve in one direction, however, it may also fail a little bit in some other directions. And let me show you exactly what it is that I'm talking about here. So let's light up your standard 1157 bulb here. So we're gonna put some power to this baby. Let me grab my lead here. Now you'll notice after I put power to this, you can see light in all directions, up to the sides, even a little bit behind the bulb. There's light in every direction being thrown. Now that's not necessarily true with all LEDs. LEDs tend to be much more unidirectional. Now certain designs can work around that, but it doesn't always work exactly the same way. So let's take this big puppy right here. You would think this is going to throw a bunch of light, and it does, but it's a very directional type of light. So when I point this thing at you, if you pretend you were behind, say, a motorcycle operating one of these, you can obviously see this is a super bright taillight here. We've got lots and lots of visibility, but as I start to turn this, one of the things I think you'll notice is it becomes less and less visible to the point where you can't really see it much at all. So that is something to think about. Think about your lenses, and again, think about the reflectors inside of the housings themselves. Just because something fits in your bike doesn't necessarily mean it's an upgrade. Because this is a little bit of a custom project, you've got to think about that. So let's see about another bulb that might handle that problem a little bit more readily. So before I put power to this, notice we've got LEDs on the top emitting light this way. Also all the way around here, it's very close to the 360-degree dispersal of light that we saw in our regular 1157. So let's light this puppy up. Now we'll notice, no matter what direction I'm turning this in, you're probably seeing that light pretty easily. And again, that's because of that multi-directional nature of the LEDs. However, the price you pay for that is this is a little bit larger than a standard 1157. Might not fit into every single housing out there. So keep in mind, even though these are reasonably easy to install, we don't necessarily know exactly which aftermarket parts play with every single motorcycle out there. So some experimentation is required because again, this is a custom type of a project. Now one more word here on turn signals, because I feel like this is a pretty important part of things. One of the problems I know a lot of people have, especially when they're switching to LED units, is the fact that their turn signal rate of flash can change. I think we've all seen the guy ripping down the road and he's got his turn signal on, it's blinking all crazy fast. You assume to yourself, oh, he must have a bulb out, but then you see maybe he's got LEDs and that doesn't make any sense, and the thing just looks really weird. Well, why does that happen and how do you fix it? Let's go to the flasher itself. The flasher is the unit that actually helps your turn signals blink. Here's your standard 552 flasher. These can be found in a bunch of motorcycles, old and new alike. This is sort of the old standby for making incandescent bulbs blink. If you look over here, you'll notice there's all sorts of mechanical innards in this puppy. This relies on mechanical contacts being made and broken, caused by electrical loads, and that's what makes your turn signals actually blink. The problem with that, of course, is that LEDs are very efficient and they don't always draw the same amount of power that a standard incandescent bulb will. How does that manifest itself? Well, again, you'll get that guy with the really fast blink rate going down the road, or worse, sometimes you'll turn your turn signal on after you've converted to LEDs and they won't blink at all. So what do you do for a solution? There's a couple products out there I think that can help with this sort of a scenario. And the first is an electronic flasher. So if you guys take a peek at this puppy and you look inside of this housing, I think you can see the printed circuit board in there. Rather than rely on mechanical context to make and break your electrical load here, causing your blinker to flash, instead what this has is just a circuit that automatically flashes at a predetermined rate. Now for some people that doesn't work out that well. Even though it should, there are still some finicky bikes out there depending on electrical system and your lighting sort of a scenario. And something like this might be a help too. This is also an electronic flasher, but one of the things to note here is this puppy. It's a tiny little potentiometer on the bottom. And what that does is allow you to manually adjust the flash rate. So whether you want to make it a little bit faster or a little bit slower, you do have that option. Kind of a cool product. One of the easier items, and you'll see them mentioned all the time to install onto a motorcycle that you've put some LEDs on, are these puppies. These are turn signal load resistors. Very simple idea here. What these do is convert some of the electrical energy coming through to heat energy. They basically put a dummy load onto the circuit and help your bike think of that new LED as drawing the same amount of power as an incandescent. They're really easy to install. They install inline, can typically be removed fairly simply as well. Regardless of what path you choose, one of these items is going to help you get your blink rate under control if you are converting from incandescent to LED. So by now, my guess is you're probably feeling a little bit more educated on what lighting products actually exist out there in the market. Keep in mind, everything you see up here isn't necessarily for sale at RevZilla.com. You can't buy all this stuff from us, but we appreciate when you do. So click that info button, check out all the lighting products available at RevZilla.com. Keep in mind too, I know that you guys are doing some custom lighting projects, and if you watch this and you still feel like you're really lost or need some special attention, drop us a comment down below. We're going to jump in and try and help you out. I'm Lemmy, I'm out of here.